Welcome to everybody from London, or actually in my case, from the Lake District where I am, to this afternoon's Food for Thought discussion, sponsored by the business school formerly known as CAS, and in the future to be known, in fact, in slightly less than a month, to be known as Bayes Business School. This is indeed our 34th session in these bite-sized 30-minute long series of Food for Thought discussions. And welcome for those of you who it may not be afternoon, but perhaps evening, nighttime, morning, or wherever you are in the world, or perhaps listening to this on podcast. Note that this is the last of this COVID-impacted school year's Food for Thought sessions. We will commence again in early September, so do please look and see when those are going to be starting again for an engaging group of invitees who we're going to be having at that time. Today, we're honored to have with us Simon Brocklebank Fowler, a long-term, in fact, 13 years, honorary visiting fellow of the business school. Simon brings to the school his expertise as a former diplomat and investment banker with over 20 years of experience in communication consultancy, which he'll be talking about today, including the CEO of 2 leading global firms. His client experience includes 3 NATO, EU governments, 15 FTSE 100 companies, and 6 global top 20 law firms, accounting, service, and strategy and consulting firms. What a fantastic mix of both private and public sector management. Currently, he's the founder and head of Firehouse Communications and also assists the business school with sessions for students to hone their communication skills. Today, he's going to speak with us about, and I quote, the code of the Rainmaker, unquote. But I guess the subtitle is about how to communicate better and to get your intended message across to your listeners. Perhaps every professor ought to take notes on this, including myself. Obviously, this is a very broad topic that's difficult to summarize in a mere 15 to 20 minutes. But if anybody can do that, I know Simon can. Remember, this session is about communication. I know that many of you will be listening to this on a podcast and not live, but for those of you who are here live, do post me your questions in the chat for Simon whilst he's speaking, as we will have some time at the end for him to be able to answer these. Simon, over to you.
Well, thank you as ever, Scott, for that, and what a privilege it's been to work with the business school over such an extended period, and indeed on the International Advisory Board before this time as an honorary visiting fellow. I'm slightly hesitant about my latest CV entry, which, given the name change issues at the business school, may mean that I gave the last in a series of speeches at City or CAS Business School, after which the school had to change its name. So I hope that we get the order and sequencing of this is properly, but what a great honor it is. So let me jump right in, and often the values in the Q&A in these situations, as you all know, rule number 1 of effective business development is let the audience do the talking. So I hope to honor that for at least half the remainder of the session. Why do Rainmakers can? Well, many of us who have a financial background, and technically I'm in the finance faculty at the school and I trained as an investment banker, we get used to measuring stuff in the numbers. But I have to say, having sat both sides of the equation, the real magic in business are the people and teams and systems who can actually grow revenue out of thin air. I've started 4 businesses in the last 25 years, 2 of which I owned. Pretty much, but with important co-founders who owned into the business. And on each occasion, there is a moment where you sit down in the old days with a telephone, a desk, a phone book, and not a lot else except your expertise. This is particularly true in professional services, into which many of the audience today have destined themselves to enter by going to a world-class business school like CAS. And professional services is one of those areas where differentiation by product is often incredibly difficult, and that actually your success will be measured by your differentiation as a person. Example, we did actually, when I was doing some work with a big 4 accounting services firm, found that they had differentiated themselves on a FTSE 100 client by spotting an auditing system error that others had not managed to spot. But in the vast number of occasions, firms like that, the big consulting and investment banking firms, are differentiating on the people on the room in a pitch presentation. This is potentially the subject of the second talk. The talk today, though, is about how you get yourself into that room as one of the 5 or 6 people. And ideally, how you manage to have won the business before you get to that meeting. And I'd say in about half the successful cases of business conversion in which I've been a principal player, and I've been on close to 300 pitches over a career in my lifetime, and that would have been distilled from perhaps 2,000 separate sets of preliminary and more advanced stage conversations. But when you get into that room, ideally you should have the big R of the 6 R's I'm going to talk about, which is relationship, before you even start the meeting. Why do relationships matter in professional services above all else? In a nutshell, and public relations, which has been my core discipline for the last 20 years, is a good example of that, is that what you're offering is something of highly intangible quality in the form of advice, whose measurement has proved distinctly elusive. We're not even in the courtroom drama process of the legal profession, where you might hope for a court judgment to validate all the advice you're given. Although 90% of commercial law cases will settle out of court. So actually, even then, your offering is mildly intangible, because it's the best deal you feel you could get, or your client is persuaded of that. So we're offering an intangible service that is often enormously expensive. And I take great pride in that, because the value of what you will all be doing, we're all doing, can be transformational in value on the client side. It can be quite binary on occasions in which I've advised, where literally a company might have ceased to exist over a given period of time if a reputational crisis had not been resolved adequately. So that's why what we do is so important, and also so hard to measure. Couple of key principles before we get into the 6 R's. One comes across a lot of organizations, typically very large ones, which have effectively systemized themselves into client irrelevance. What do I mean by that? I mean that they have codified their work as if they were putting together a quite expensive motor car, and they've broken the work down into single pieces of execution, which a trained person is able to do on their own, absent tight supervision, and often without a huge amount of experience to their hands, save the company and staff handbook. The essence of successful rainmaking is actually knowing the handbook and then throwing it out the window, I say slightly dangerously, starting from first principles. And the first principle is not what do you have to offer. We're not offering a suite of off the rack suiting. We're offering bespoke and tailored, and that's true even in big businesses like the Big 4 accounting services firm, that every organization has something that is uniquely difficult about them, and part of that is to find that out. And if you're in what I'd call a leading profession, and I would include the law, management consulting, investment banking, communications consulting in this, and at its best accounting services, but not de facto, then actually what you're offering is a much bigger issue for the client. In my own profession, I often get calls from people saying, Simon, we don't like what the Financial Times is writing about us, go and fix it. Well, that's sort of one aspect of the problem, but typically the Financial Times is speaking for a much bigger aspect of a client challenge. And I'll get to that when we look at resourcefulness later in the R's. But let me start with the first one. The first one is research. I can't tell you how often I have seen competitor offerings which have evidenced the volume of FTSE 100, Fortune 500 clients they have, have set out a perfectly good theoretical structure for what communications issues might be, and often tailored it to the particular client sector, but have got no further than that. So rule number one of rainmaking is you know your client really well before you have the first conversation. My favorite case study of this is when we went in for a pre-pitch presentation with a client at a top 10 international litigation firm, and the managing partner of the global firm turned to his global head of communications and said, have you given these guys the pitch document already, because they seem to know what all the problems are? And she said, no, not at all. I've never met them before. But we'd done our ring round, we'd done it quietly, and we went in knowing more about that business probably than the head of communications did, I say dangerously. And that time is never wasted. I encourage all our people to be hungry readers of the mainstream media. I was delighted to see polling shows yesterday the mainstream media is not only more accurate than social media, but is significantly more trusted, although there's clearly a digital element. But you need to be tracking your sector and your targets very much in that. And then the research we do ahead of a presentation will be typically involve 20 stakeholders and is probably about £10,000 of cost in time. When I worked for other people, I had to explain why we were doing all of this resource heavy stuff. And I said, we can either spend £10,000 and end up with a 50-50 chance of getting the business, or we can do no research and have a 0 chance of getting the business, or any point in between. And eventually I did win that argument, and we actually won't go for stuff where we don't have the ability to do that. My favorite case example of relevance, which is segueing into the second R, was a presentation which I can name to Old Mutual, as this was nearly 20 years ago. It was a big demutualization project led by an investment bank in South Africa. The biggest challenge was going to be a retail offering in an immature investment market like at that point South Africa, where the retail market was very undeveloped. Typically it's 50% of demand in the US, 30% in the UK. It was running at about 0% in South Africa at that point. And the firm I represented had been a great player in aspects of financial PR life, but had not done a retail-driven offering. And we were going in against a competitor firm called G. Rogerson, that we subsequently acquired. Not quite sure why, that's another story, because we did win the day. G. Rogerson had done all the BP, BT, British Airways PR stuff in the UK and internationally, and were clearly hot favourites to win. And we knew they would kill us on this issue of the retail offering because we hadn't done one. So what did we do? We actually compiled the world's largest database, I think, of successful retail offerings, and analysed 20 of them at a level of detail that was pretty breathtaking. Bad news, everybody, if you're the Rainmaker leading the team, as I was on that occasion, you actually have to read everything, because at the end of the day, you're everybody's backup if they miss the point. And also you're going to have to bring it together in a holistic argument that's relevant for the client. So we had researched what Matt Damon in that movie about Mars said, the SH1T out of these range of topics, and we knew exactly what we were doing in theory, having never done it. So we start the presentation, which typically has a sort of preamble, after I'd spoken for about a minute, the head investment banker said, Simon, you can be quiet now. We know you're pretty good at a bunch of stuff. All we want to know is the retail offer going to fall over? And the whole meeting became about that discussion of one single point of failure. And because we'd done our research, they were convinced, actually, we ended up picking up some points the other side missed, who'd actually done a lot of these. And that worked very well for us, and a great win. The next R, after research and relevance, is reliability. We were joking earlier, Scott and I, that turning up is 90% of successful rainmaking. Actually, it's 100%. And he and I turned up from remote hotel rooms for this important meeting. But reliability is at the essence of all great brands. So what you never want to have said about you, as I've heard said about colleagues over the years, is they're better before lunch, was quite a standard statement. And there are one or two journalists I deal with whom that is obviously true. And certainly availability is key. My favorite story of that was I took a call at 3 a.m. because I'm sad enough to leave my phone on all night. It was an Arab business person I'd had some dealings with, and I said, do you know what time it is? He said, yes, I do. I said, why are you ringing me? He said, I'm in a basement jail in Jeddah under arrest. And I said, well, shouldn't you be saving this phone call for your phone call to the one key person, your lawyer, I assume? And he said, Simon, you are my call. And literally, had I not picked up that telephone at that point, that man would have been in jail for a considerably longer period of time. I did cutely ask him why he hadn't rung his wife, to which he replied that he wasn't sure he knew what she'd do with the information. So I think my reputation for reliably taking phone calls from people in distress and trying to get the system moving was a very good example of that. The next R, the fourth R, is resilience. This is a hot topic taught at many business schools. A lot of it's based out of elite sports programs, actually, and we're seeing how even those people can find resilience in the spotlight incredibly testing, and we have huge sympathy with them, but a degree of resilience is required. The example I would give in this case is I've been involved in situations with kidnap and ransom where there's been a global media interest. And literally one has been on the phone hearing from typically special forces advisors that the terrorists are going to start shooting people if a piece appears in a newspaper of which they are disapproving. And our biggest job in that case was keeping the family and relatives, friends of the victims, the hostages, from talking to the newspapers. They were being rung the whole time. And I can tell you that takes quite a lot of resilience from the team, particularly the juniors on the team who said we didn't join PR to be making life and death decisions. I said, well, we're not making the decisions, we're stopping somebody else taking them. So that a degree of physical and mental resilience is certainly essential, and being perceived to have that. Nobody wants to think you're going to fail on the 100th time in case it's them. So we need, if we can, 100 out of 100. Resourcefulness. This is back to what does the client want. The client thinks they've got a problem. They've identified your profession and your firm perhaps as the solution to that problem. But what they really want is a trusted advisor. And this is the sort of zenith of the advisory profession, where you're the call, not because you necessarily know the answer, but you know where it can be found. And we've certainly often been tapped for our advice on other advisors who might suit. Business schools good to partner with, of which CAS has been an honored partner on a number of occasions with commercial organizations. And actually you're a solutions provider if you're leading that team. And that really defines your role in a client relationship, which is the last of the R's. So the relationship is holistically made up of all of this stuff. Your best time invested with anyone you ever know, by the way, is just after they've been fired, because they know you do not need them then. And I just pass that on as a human tip that, as in real life, being good to friends in their adversity rather than your own is a great secret to sustainable rainmaking relationships. And lastly, a quick shout out for the not-for-profit sector. I've been on the development board of 5 major charities, or at the founding board of a bunch of smaller charities. And there's not one of those that has not been enormously rewarding in life, but also enormously rewarding in relationship, renewal, refreshment, and direct commercial opportunities. So that's a quick canter through, on which note, over to you, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Simon. There's an example for you. We said to Simon we wanted to leave 10 minutes at the end, and that's exactly what you did. Seeing it click over now, the longer I talk to now, only 9 minutes. So let me actually quickly go on, because there are a couple of questions that have come around. But one to start off with from here is, because there are some students who are on, any recommendation on how a student communicates best? And this relates to one of the questions that has come as well, because in an era of LinkedIn and relationships being very, very much based on some of the social media and electronics, but where their relationships tend to be with people who aren't yet at a point where they can be as helpful as they would want to be. How do you build those relationships that are up as opposed to just sideways with you?
That's a really interesting point. So, and not all of this is going to be hugely fashionable, because some of it's quite old school. And I think these principles actually work through social media almost as well. I mean, the reality as a parent is that, my daughter at the age of 16 had, 1,000 nominally live relationships, that people who went to a school or a university in particular, in reality, knew everybody in their year in a way that was simply not true for those of us at university in the 70s and 80s, where you would count yourself as quite well plugged in if you knew a couple of hundred people. But the reality through social media is you can know that whole peer group. And so your digital brand is undoubtedly important, and all the obvious points there apply about privacy settings. But even within a private setting, you just want to think that your employer, and some of them are going to ask at a stage in the interview process, they're going to want the key to your private social network, and you want that pretty darn clean, I suggest. There's a great American book that's 20, 30 years old by a Harvard professor who talked of the power of the weak connection. Most of us anthropologically are going to have 6 people, our tight 6 that we are close to. The reality is they will not get you business generally. Actually, all my tight 6, you know who you are. Some of you are on this call, have got me business. Thank you for that. But the real value is their other tight 6, the one you're not in. It's the beyond step. And social media is very important in that. But I do know some phenomenally successful younger networkers. And I got 3 tips. One is, all your friends have parents. A lot of them are still employed, and they at least should be able to give you a talk through within your tight 6 or the 30 beyond that. If you know somebody's dad's an MD in a high banking firm you want to get into, don't be embarrassed to ask your friend, because you may have a parent or an uncle or a tutor that you can reciprocate with. So just look at who those connections might be. The second thing is, there is no better way of getting noticed than starting something. And the credit you get for starting a networking platform is phenomenal. So think about doing that and make it physical as times allow. If you've got a group that's interested in a sector or a not-for-profit area or something that is of ancillary business value, set it up. My favorite story here, this is absolutely true, is of a very young partner at a firm beginning with M that everybody's heard of, whose bride, who works at a leading investment banking franchise, he set up the speed dating club at Oxford University and found himself a wife over time by setting it up. He was the compere, he was not a participant. And in fact, through that event, he met somebody who was able to get him insights. So start something up. And then the third thing is, be known as a reciprocator, and do that, show that through new media, show that in how you behave, how you respond to phone calls in a timely way. Pick up the phone when the other person isn't going to give you something you need. So be an engine of reciprocity, and that word will get out there quite quickly. So those are ways that are good for you to network.
And I guess you just hope that you're not being called from a jail with that story that you that you gave. By the way, there was at least one person who said they absolutely loved that story, Simon. So thank you for bringing that one in.
Yeah.
There's another question here, actually from somebody who's a board member of a number of FTSE 100 companies, who number one said thank you, Simon, but also said, can you talk a little bit more about how you make yourself the most relevant of a cadre of what I guess would be superficially almost equally qualified advisors, or indeed, if we want to put it from a student perspective, candidates, from different disciplines working on a deal or in trying to get a job. How do you really differentiate yourself in today's world? I know you went through your R's, but perhaps expanding on that.
Yeah, no, I think differentiation, and your FTSE colleague is entirely right. The differentiation within professional services is extremely difficult. Two types of gin, they've got different botanicals. Well, the botanicals that we're talking about are essentially knowledge-based botanicals. And I think if I can be where I've tended to score best is when you've spotted something that other people haven't noted might be relevant. So this is back to the research. You've got to know something that somebody else hasn't noticed is a really strong play. I think cross-references and cross-knowledge can work very well as you come through life. And I've mentioned not-for-profits, who certainly taught me a huge amount. I think other areas of engagement, be it in public policy, I've done a lot of think tank work. So going in as a financial PR, alert to the regulatory challenges. In my case, knowing what the regulatory position is, because maybe I rang the special advisor to the Minister of State to the day before in your industry. And if you can throw in oh, by the way, government's thinking a bit about this and wondering what you're doing about your renewable strategy in those red wall seats. And do that as a throwaway, as part of a presentation that might be based on how they can tune up their annual results presentation. That sort of perception of lateral added value, the field next door, that your competitors who are maybe running off a tighter template haven't looked at, can work well.
Yeah, it's interesting. A parallel to that is I always tell my students to make sure that when there's guest speakers coming to the school, for major events, to make sure that you're one of the people who's sitting there in the audience, if it happens to be in person, as we hope to get back to, or whether it's on something like this, because even just being able to name drop that, or to be able to say that you've heard something from somebody like that, I think is critical. Maybe time for just one final question that's come in from one of the other professors at the school. Given that you know a bit about the school, what do you think that the school should do to make sure that its students do listen to this? Now, I should point out that perhaps not everybody knows that you will be in the new year more deeply engaged with the school in doing some coaching on the communication side and interviewing side. But other than, of course, spending more of your time, and you've been a very kind honorary visiting fellow of the school, and with your time in the past, and I think we will be using more of it. But other than more of Simon, what would you recommend that we do?
I think there's nothing to beat face-to-face engagement. It's like, and this is not a wholly happy analogy, but Gareth Southgate, bless him, who's reinvented some sense of sort of national direction and unity. You practice doing the thing that you know it may come down to. And in his case, he got the team practicing penalties. Actually, the last round World Cup, that worked pretty well. But you practice doing the thing it comes down to. And what you're hiring is going to come down to, and it will prepare you along the whole chain of the process, is you're going to sit in a room with a panel or a couple of people who are much more experienced than you are in life and in the job you're about to take on. And you're going to persuade them that you can become, that you can add value to that mix in maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And so my recommendation to the school is, knowing you give great digital support and other forms of support, I think we need, post-COVID, to find a way of getting your students and cohorts exposure in that one-to-one or tight environment in a 20-minute face-to-face interview, which is going to be a lot about personal chemistry for all the SAT scores that they've got, all the GMATs they've seen, which are going to be within a tiny handful of points of others. And the hope, this is back to the earlier question about differentiation, is that hiring organizations are beginning to get clever enough not to hire the person who knows everything you know because they went to the same schools or look and feel the same demographically, but to hire the person who knows the 80% of stuff you don't know. And I think if we can assist the students to present that, communicate that in a personal environment, then the, I call it the CAS difference, is something that will begin to shine ever more brightly in the hiring periods ahead.
And at that point in time, of course, being the Bayes difference. Well,
I am your last speaker, as we said.
You are the last.
The series finished with me. Oh dear. Anyway, I hope to be back under new colours.
Out with a bang, I think I must say, Simon, on that. We are out of time. Obviously, you and I could talk, and there were more questions coming in, but and I even have two that were texted to me of people who knew how to get me on that way. This has been wonderful. I think this is a great last one for the current academic year. And of course, we hope that we will be seeing everybody in September, early September. So look for the notices on that. But with that, Simon, I'd like to, on behalf of the school, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us today from where you are in Portugal. I welcome you. Good luck in getting back to the UK. And for everybody else, and for those of you watching this as a podcast, glad for you to hear us, not live, but for those of you online, great that you could join us. Thank you all very much. And thank you very, very much, Simon.
Thank you very much.